All right, party people, welcome to the North Star Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Jenkins, and I just got a quick question before we get started. Have you guys ever felt like somebody, something was trying to block you or stop you from something that you know you needed to do or wanted to do? Well, that has been my experience getting this podcast started. Battling against... I ain't gonna lie, it's powers and principalities, you know what I'm saying? That's exactly what it is. And one of those powers and principalities that I want to talk about today, kind of indirectly, is fear. So I guess one of my issues battling these powers and principalities has been my own internal shortcomings, fear of my own internal shortcomings, or fear of my own inability to do what I want to do here. It's not quite fear of inability to do it. It's an unfounded, really baseless fear. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book Dune or have seen maybe the movie Dune, but Dune was about I forget the guy's name, but it's a great science fiction novel, and it's about set in the distant future where these nobles have discovered this. It's really a political struggle for power in the future, and an integral part of this struggle for power is this thing called spice, and it's basically a drug of some sort that gives you supernatural abilities, and it's a really deep story. It's a really well crafted story. It's got some really deep, detailed world building in it. This is what I guess we call it nowadays, world building. Anyway, one of the things that they touch on in that book Dune, or the TV show, the movie, is that fear is the mind killer. And that is so true in so many ways. When you are afraid, in fact, that's a deep secret that the author, and again, his name escapes me. That's a deep secret that the author has revealed to us, the people who might have the pleasure of reading that book. And if you haven't read it, I suggest you do. It's a really good book. Anyway, fear is the mind killer. Now, when I say fear is the mind killer, what do I mean? Well, there are people out there who know that fear is a mind killer. Fear is what you use to put the body into what we're all familiar with, the fight or flight response, right? So you use fear purposely to put people into a fight or flight response, and that short circuits your rational ability to think. Now, as I said, this is a well-known thing amongst the powers that be in the what they say, the powers that be in the evil that is. Many people, as I say, understand this concept of fear being the mind killer, and they use fear to kill our minds, whether it's fear of a terrorist attack, fear of this, fear of that, fear of the outsider, fear of the others. People use fear to make us afraid, to short circuit our ability to rationally think. Now, one of the reasons I mention that is because in today's episode of the North Star Podcast, one of the things that I want to touch on is how they use fear, how fear is used to specifically aim toward black people to keep us corralled and thinking and acting in certain ways. Fear is used specifically by people who wish to have power, who wish to gain power, to corral you and make you do what they want you to do and behave in the way that they want you to behave, even if that way of behavior, that mode of behavior, is contrary to your own best interest. So this is called, some people call it brainwashing. It goes by many terms. Mind control, rather, not brainwashing, more or less, but mind control. It's fear-based mind control, trauma-based mind control. Now, one way that this is done specifically, this mind control, this using fear to hack our brains, to short circuit our ability to think and motivate us into actions that may not be good for us. One of the ways this is done is when people use the specter of slavery. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Today's subject is why won't they leave slavery in the past? First of all, before we go any further, I think we should define what slavery is. Now, People say, well, you ain't got to define slavery. We know what slavery is. Slavery is when white folks had us black folks picking cotton and under the bullwhip days. The slaves remember. Y'all read that book? That's a good one. I think I got that back there somewhere. Bullwhip days, the slaves remember. Everybody knows that's what slavery was, right? It was the evil, wicked white man enslaving the black man. Well, that was one example of slavery historically, but that is not what slavery is. Just so y'all know, I'm coming at everything that I do and say from a more libertarian perspective. And the reason I do that is this is the North Star podcast. I'm concerned with freedom. I'm not concerned with getting power, getting elected to office, wielding power over other people. I'm concerned with freedom. And so you have to have an accurate definition of things if you wish to frame them properly. And the only way you can get freedom is to frame things properly, to set up your own thinking properly so you can understand the direction you need to be traveling in. In this case, that direction is away from fear. The fear that is induced purposefully by people who wish to control us by using the specter, the phantasm of slavery. Now, the reason they won't leave slavery in the past is because I'm going to give you this quote, and I can't remember where I got this quote from. There's a book that I intend to read, and I have it on my reading list, but the author's name is not written here. I neglected. I was remiss in my duties here. But anyway, the quote is this: hatred and the spirit of sacrifice are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of the liberated grandchildren. Check that out. Hatred and the spirit of sacrifice are nourished, they're fed by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of the liberated grandchildren of those enslaved ancestors. You see what I'm saying? That's why they won't let slavery die. That's why the other day, it was a couple of weeks ago, I guess, maybe a few weeks ago, you had Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and all these cats up there hanging out with Al Sharpton at the National, what does he call it now Network, National Action, whatever his organization is called. Essentially kissing Al Sharpton's ring, and they were all promising reparations. They'll never let slavery stay in the past. They keep digging it up. And they keep digging it up because they wish to spark in you the fear and anger that comes from thinking about the image of your enslaved ancestors, rather than thinking about how we, the great-great-great-grandchildren, are liberated and how we have available to us all the means of freedom. The path to freedom is clearly wide open. There's some pitfalls along the way, of course, just like there are on any journey. But those pitfalls are essentially, most of them are of our own manufacture. And that's, to me, that's just simple truth. But like I say, I want to define what slavery is before I go too far. Slavery is the use of force or violence to cause someone to work for your ends rather than their own. In other words, slavery is a theft of labor, a theft of someone's energy and labor and the products that they can produce with that energy and labor. That's what slavery is. Now, here is that's from a libertarian perspective, and it's not really. It's not germane to the conversation that it's a libertarian perspective, because that is essentially what slavery truly is. Slavery is using force to make someone else work for your goals or your ends or your enrichment. It's a theft of labor, theft of energy. And what it really is it's the theft of a person's private property. You see, private property is extremely important to the cause of freedom. Now, remember, we said we wanted to be free. We didn't say we wanted handouts. We didn't say we wanted programs and this, that, and other. We said we want to be free. So if you want to be free, one of the things you have to start with is private property. Now, the most important form of private property is yourself. You own yourself. Slavery has been abolished since 1865. Really, since 1965 is when it was the final nails were put in the coffin. Nonetheless, we've been out of slavery for, 135, 40 years, whatever the case may be. So why do they keep bringing it back up? They keep bringing it back up to keep you angry and upset, to use the fear of racism, the racism that we paint with broad brushes and broad strokes back at those times. They used the fear of that to hack into our brains as black people and as white people too. It's a double-edged sword. But they use that fear to make us do their bidding. In this case, and like I said, I don't want this thing to be overtly political because I want to talk about principles mostly. But we'll talk about politics when we need to illustrate principles. So they use the Democratic Party in this case, or rather the Democrat Party. Let's got to get the semantics right. The Democrat Party uses racism and slavery, specifically slavery, as what we're talking about today. They use the fear of that and the anger that it engenders to induce a fight or flight response in people so that you do not think rationally about things that you should be thinking coldly and dispassionately and rationally about. That is what the uses of slavery are. That is what they do with it nowadays. That's why they don't let it die. Even Snoop Dogg one time said, man, why do they keep making movies about, what was it, Django or some movie he was commenting on? He said, why do they keep making movies about it? Why do they keep bringing this up? They keep bringing this up because it keeps us in line. It keeps us thinking about the image of enslaved ancestors, and instead of looking at the vista of freedom that lies before us, ready for the taking. And see, you should detect in my voice, there's a strange note in my voice, a strange timbre, however you say that. That I don't talk about with a defeatist attitude. I don't talk about, oh, there's racism stopping me. Well, first of all, if you're a child of God, you say you're a child of God, how is racism going to stop you? I thought we actually believe that he that is within me is greater than all. We believe that, right? That's what we say. Well, if we say that, and if we truly believe that, then we're not concerned about racism. Because they can't stop us. What we should be concerned with is moving forward. What we should be concerned with is not having someone hack our brains, you know what I'm saying? Using fear and anger and hatred, which is a clear tactic to keep us thinking about things that aren't actually really affecting us anymore, and to keep our minds distracted from the things that do affect us. The things that do affect us are things like out of wedlock children. Things that do affect us is things like not investing in our own private property, our first form and most important form of private property, which is ourselves, not developing ourselves and our skills to get the things that we want to do, to move forward towards those ends and means that we want. Right? Now, so we've defined what slavery is, right? And we said that slavery was essentially destroying someone's private ownership of private property within themselves and stealing their energy and their labor to use it for your own ends. Now, here's the other dirty little secret about slavery. That the people who want to hack your brains using fear and anger, they don't want to talk about this. America is not the only country that ever had slavery. In fact, they are deliberately distorting the view of history when they talk about how bad America was with slavery. And don't get me wrong, folks, I'm a historian by training. I went to school for it. I got a degree in history. I was president of Black History class. I read continuously. I know that slavery was a terrible thing. I understand that. What I also understand, however, is that when slavery came to America, it was the beginning of the end for slavery. When I also understand that if you look back properly at history, you'll find that it wasn't white people that started slavery. It was all people at all times on every continent, everywhere on this planet, always and forever had slaves. And most of the time, for the vast majority of human history, each one of those people on each one of the continents and each one of the regions, each one of the countries, each one of the villages, each one of the hamlets that had slaves usually had people who looked just like them as slaves. So in Africa, there was already slaves, but they were owned by other black Africans. In Europe, there were slaves. Check this out, guys. Human history is only, according to mainstream science, only about 6,000 years old or something like that. This is the dawn of history, is when people started using writing to record things that you can actually study, and therefore it's the historical era. For all that time, there was slaves. That for that whole time, that whole 6,000 years, there was slaves, except for the last 200 years out of that 6,000, starting back in about 1865, really about 1835, I think it was. You had cats like Wilberforce over in Britain. He was an abolitionist over in Britain. I think he was he a military man too? I'm going from memory here. But this guy, William Wilberforce, I believe his name was. If I'm getting that wrong, forgive me. I'm going off the top of the head here. But this guy, William Wilberforce, began this crusade in the early 1800s that culminated, I think, in the 1830s. They said, hey, man, we cannot have slavery in Britain anymore. And they stopped. And you know how they ended slavery? They paid everybody a handsome sum of money. All slave owners, that people, so-called slave owners. It's illegitimate to say you can own a human being. But the so-called slave owners were paid by the government and forced to say, hey, it's illegal now. Here's, X amount of thousands of dollars or whatever the case was. Your slaves are now free. Well, that was the first blow to slavery. That was by English Christian white men. The second major blow to slavery in the whole world, the whole entire world still had slavery at that point. And the second powerful blow that started to spell the unraveling or the beginning of the end of slavery was the founding of this country, the United States, with the so-called hated founding fathers who were racist and all this stuff. If you actually read any of their writings, they did not start slavery. They inherited slavery. When they were born, slavery was already a thing, and they all condemned it. Well, most of them condemned it. Many of them condemned it. Thomas Jefferson condemned it. Washington, Adams, all these cats, they condemned it in the strongest terms. However, they understood that you couldn't just end slavery overnight, because what do you do with the people who barely speak the language, who are totally illiterate, who have no legal status, can't own anything, and in many cases don't know how to do anything except for tend the crops which they can't by law own? What do you do to those people? How cruel is that for you to free somebody that can't function as an adult in the world as it exists? What are you going to do? Just put them out on the street and say, hey, well, sorry, slavery's over. You're free. Go. Run. Do what you want to do. Do what you want to do. How? You can't own no land. You know what I'm saying? How cruel is that? How short-sighted is that? That's the kind of thing that the founding fathers, many of the founding fathers, not all of them were anti-slavery, but many of them were. That's the kind of things that they write about. They cannot morally set slaves free, because the slaves would perish immediately. They had no legal standing in this country. Thomas Jefferson, who's supposed to be, he's such a devil, was such a racist devil. Well, this guy tried all his political career to end slavery. He submitted multiple bills to try to get passed into law, and they were defeated. Now, if you're working through the political system and you're submitting bills left and right and they keep getting defeated, what do you do? Do you say that person's a racist and deserves to have a statue torn down or something like that? Is that really a racist? The person who was, as I understand it, over in Europe with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, where by the way, as we just established, over in London, they were free in England. So he took his black mistress over to England or France and all that, and walked around with her as an equal. In pretty much the only place on earth that he could have done that, if that whole Sally Hemings thing is even true. There's some controversy over that. I think it is true personally, just from what I've read on it, but that's a digression. The point I'm making is the first major blow to the end of slavery, toward ending slavery, was William Wilberforce, I think his name was, over in England, 1830s. The second major blow was the establishment of the United States, when you had men saying all men are created equal. And then looking at slaves, their so-called slaves, their African captives that they had, and saying, well, dang, how can we say all men are created equal when we have slaves? But yet, how do we end it? We can't get the votes. We can't. You can't set people free, because if you do, they'll starve en masse, perish en masse in terrible, agonizing ways. You can't also set them free, because let's get real, you've kept them in slavery. Now, if you just set them all free, they're going to be angry and ready to fight. So you'll tear the whole society apart. You'll have, in some places in the South, there were more slaves than whites. So you set them all free, and now it's bedlam and chaos, just an orgy of violence. No, that's a real consideration. Did you know any of this stuff, by the way? Am I saying anything that's new to you? You can read Thomas Sowell. Dr. Thomas Sowell has a book called, I think it's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Very interesting book. If you check that out, he spells out how the British ended slavery. The British were so passionate about ending slavery that they sent their military to their colonies, like India and all over in Africa and stuff like that, and in the Arab world, the Muslim world. Because, oh, by the way, the Muslims, who we love to take Islamic names and stuff, you know what I'm saying? The Muslims trafficked in slaves more than whites did. In fact, the Muslims trafficked in white slaves more than any European ever trafficked in black slaves. And they trafficked in black slaves more than Europeans did. And they were arguably more brutal about it. But it's cool because Islam is cool and we take their names. Yo, my name Malik. You know what I'm saying? My name Musa Ibn Bin. Yeah, okay. If you haven't heard any of these things before, and I'm not trying to, I'm telling you the truth as far as I understand it. I try to do a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of thinking about stuff like that. Why? Because I want to know the truth. Why? Because the truth shall make you free. Actually, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, which is an apocryphal gospel, he said something like, well, first you're going to know the truth, and then you're going to get mad. You're going to be bothered in your spirit because the truth ain't comfortable. And so maybe that, that cognitive dissonance, that discomfort that you're feeling, if you're hearing some of y'all hearing this, it's not because I'm lying to you or something like that. It's because the truth is not meant to make you feel comfortable. And the reason that we need to know the truth is so that people can't use fear and anger. And it's really fear. It's fear of the disgrace of slavery is what it is. Fear of returning to the disgrace and the ignominy of slavery. These people that want to use that fear of disgrace to hack our brains, right? This is what we're talking about. That's why they keep bringing slavery. That's why they'll never let slavery die. And if you're feeling discomfort right now, it may be because that cognitive dissonance, that what is it, that brainwash shattering? I'm not going to call anybody brainwashed, but in many ways, that's what we all are. And we exist under a system that purposefully uses fear and falsehoods to program us to do what they want us to do. And this is both sides, by the way. I'm not just talking about the Democrat Party. The Republicans do it in their own way. And that's why I don't really get down with politics like that. I don't vote anymore because there's nobody in politics that I see who is worthy of my vote. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. I'm a pretty honorable person. I strive to be honorable. I'm not perfect. I fail all the time, miserably sometimes. However, I strive to be an honorable man. I strive to keep my word, for example. And how can I vote for somebody that is not even as honorable as me? Much less, forget about me. My grandfather, Robert Jenkins Sr., was one of the most honorable, holy men that I knew, that I've ever known. And he was an illiterate sharecropper much of his life. Later became a master mechanic. The whole time that I knew him, he was a master mechanic. But totally illiterate. And yet, he was probably one of the best human beings I've ever known, right? So if I can't get somebody in politics to vote for that can even fetch my grandpa's slippers, yeah, what? Really? Why would I lower myself to that level and vote for that kind of person? That's who I'm placing my hope in? Nah. Negativo. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, I'm digressing. Y'all forgive my rant. What we're talking about here is slavery and why they won't let it die. Now, we've already discussed kind of how the true history of slavery, how the Muslims actually were, slavery is bad enough as it is, but the Islamic world and the African world to this day still have slaves in certain parts of those countries, in the Middle East and in Africa, North Africa, MENA, they call it, Middle East, North Africa. There's still slavery in there. Still slavery. I think it was Madagascar or something like that. There's literally a slave auction there. But yet, the first people on earth to have any inkling or to start even thinking that slavery might possibly be wrong were white Christians. White Christian males, the same founding fathers in many cases that people want to demonize. That's because they're purposefully not letting us look back at history through the proper lens. They're doing that again to induce that fear of the ignominy of slavery, the fear of being covered in that shame and disgrace again, the fear of that pain and anguish and destruction of the spirit. They use that fear to control us. And so when you see stuff on like that on TV, and in other words, to me, anytime someone is pointing out how slavery, this and that, and this guy's a racist and that guy's a racist, you this, I think to myself, snake. Mind controller is what he's trying to be. He wants me to, and guess what? If he wants me to do something that's against my own best interest, but it's in his interest, that's the definition of slavery right there. Using someone by force, fraud, or coercion to do work that you want them to do that they don't want to normally do, that's against their will to do normally. That is the definition of slavery. And so when someone hacks your brain using the fear and threat of slavery and racism to make you vote for them, or to make you do this, or to make you go over here or not go over here, or not listen to this or listen to that, that is the definition of slavery. Now, it's not physical slavery. It's mental slavery. You know what I'm saying? Spiritual bondage, perhaps. Psychological bondage or something like that. Still bondage. Still being forced through fear of violence to do the will of somebody else. Look how close to the definition of slavery is to the definition of terrorism. I never thought about that before. That's very interesting though. Another thing they were talking about earlier, I mentioned before I started this whole episode, it was about, Al Sharpton everybody going to kiss his ring. And they were really talking about reparations. And so the way I look at reparations is pretty simple. From the libertarian perspective, reparations are actually a viable thing if certain conditions are met. Unfortunately, just to put the bottom line up front, reparations for slavery doesn't meet any of the preconditions. So if in libertarian philosophy, if you harm somebody, you do owe them recompense. You do owe them some payback. You literally do have to pay them back to make things right. And if that's monetary or land or farmland or whatever, then so be it. Whatever is deemed acceptable by the injured party. That's the libertarian philosophy on that. However, the stipulation is you have to be able to clearly show injury. You have to be able to clearly show that you personally were hurt, and you have to be able to clearly show that this person, A, B, or C, clearly did the hurting or the injury. Well, you cannot satisfy any of those conditions or criteria through providing reparations for slavery. First of all, because you can't prove that anybody alive today was a slave owner. Nobody alive today ever owned slaves in America. With the exception of, you see the news reports sometimes where you see some Indians and certain Mexicans and really kind of people of all races where they hold people's visas and green cards against them, and you can't leave the house. If you do, we're going to send you back to the mother country of where we came from. There's slavery like that, but on a widespread basis, nobody owns any slaves. And here's the other thing. If you know anything about history, you know that in this country in about, I think it was around 1880, after the Civil War, from the 1880s up until the 1920s, we had vast migration from Europe. So that when you look around today, most of the white people you see here weren't the same white people that were in this country that owned slaves before 1865. Most of the people here today are from Western Europe and really from all over Europe, Italians, whatever they may be, but they came during the 1880s to 1920s migrations. In other words, they were probably barely more than serfs themselves when they came over here, yet we're going to talk about they owe reparations? No, these people never owned a slave. And set aside the fact that neither I nor anybody I know has ever been a slave. So therefore, you cannot justly extract payment from anybody over the issue of African slavery in America. In other words, the time has passed, and that's pretty significant to say that, because the time of slavery has passed. The time for fearing and hating and being upset about slavery has passed. because I refuse to let anybody else have that power over me, the power to herd me against my will, to make me a modern day psychological slave by using the threat and the specter of historical slavery. And I hope that this talk has shed some light on the subject, and I hope that I haven't been any unintentionally misleading about anything. If I have been misleading, again, it is definitely unintentionally, but it's not. The mistakes are all mine, as they say. Anyway, I would like to thank you guys for tuning in to the North Star Podcast, where we talk about freedom in all its facets. My name is Robert Jenkins. It's been my pleasure to speak with you today. And I want to wish you 2 digits as we close out. Y'all have a good one. Peace.